Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to start this plenary session, which will be the last of this conference. We have in this session two speakers from the other side of the Atlantic, two people from the United States with different backgrounds. The first one is Patricia Deegan, which has a consumer background. The second one is John Strauss, who is a clinician and researcher. That's his background. Both of them will try to give their ideas about recovery processes, about coping with mental illness, about surviving, and about understanding what is really going on in the lives of people with mental illness. The first of them to speak is Patricia Deegan. She's from Massachusetts in the United States. She has a doctorate in psychology. She has been working as a clinical director of community-based services, and she was a director of the Northern Independent Living Program. She was also co-founder of the National Empowerment Center, and she has given lectures, workshops, and trainings, especially on the themes of recovery and empowerment. And for that reason, I think it's important to know that she is, as she told me herself, a woman with a psychiatric disability, with a diagnosis of major mental illness since her teenage years. Patricia Deegan.
Good morning, everyone. It's good to be here. We have a wonderful country. The paper I'm going to deliver today is called Recovery as a Journey of the Heart. And I'll be working on keeping my pace a little on the slow side so that the interpreters will be able to get the message through to other folks as well. I'd like to thank you for this opportunity to speak with you today. As a person with a psychiatric disability who is also a mental health professional, I see that there is an important distinction to be made between the concept of rehabilitation and the concept of recovery. I would argue that people with disabilities do not get rehabilitated in the same sense that cars get tuned up or televisions get repaired. People with disabilities are not passive recipients of rehabilitation services. We are not objects to be acted upon, but rather we are human subjects who can take a stand toward what is distressing to us and actively participate in our own recovery process. Rehabilitation programs and services refer to only one of the tools that are available to people with psychiatric disabilities to use as part of our recovery process. In other words, rehabilitation refers to the services and technologies that are made available to people with disabilities so that we might learn adaptive skills in areas of work, socialization, education, community living, etc. Recovery, on the other hand, refers to the lived experience or the real-life experience of people as we rebuild our lives and reach our personal goals. In summary, we might say that rehabilitation refers to the world pole and that recovery refers to the self pole of the same phenomena. I have been asked to speak about outcomes, but of course, from the perspective of the person with a psychiatric disability, we do not think in terms of outcomes. Rather, we think in terms of my life. We are concerned as individuals with the quality of our lives and having the opportunity to better ourselves and our situation. What for the researcher is an outcome is for me, my life. Before talking more about the recovery process, I would like to say that if outcomes of professional services are to change, such that services become truly helpful and supportive of our recovery process, then we must begin to train mental health professionals in a different way. The message I would like to bring to you today is that it is not enough to merely teach students facts and figures and knowledge. We must help students of the mental health professions to seek wisdom. There's a difference between knowledge and wisdom. The etymological root of the word knowledge comes from the Middle English, to recognize. And indeed, students in the various mental health-related disciplines are required to recognize and to master a specific field of knowledge. They are required to know how to conduct empirical inquiry, to formulate findings, to contribute to theoretical models, to learn clinical skills, etc. However, students are not required to seek wisdom. Wisdom comes from the Greek eidin, which means to see the form or essence of that which is. Thus, most students emerge from their studies full of knowledge or the ability to recognize things, but they lack wisdom or the ability to see the form or essence of that which is. For example, when we teach our students about the heart, we teach them that the heart is a pump, a type of organic machine with valves and chambers. And indeed, in time, they learn to recognize the anatomical heart in all its detail. After successfully passing their final anatomy exam, we say, this student knows about the heart. But in wisdom, we would have to doubt this statement. Wisdom would seek the form or the essence of the heart. In wisdom, we would see that the anatomical heart, which we have given our students to study, is nobody's heart. It is a heart that could belong to anybody, and therefore it belongs to nobody. Wisdom would have us understand that there is another heart. There is a heart that we know about long before we are taught that the heart is a pump. I am speaking here of the heart that can break, the heart that grows weary, the hardened heart, the heartless one, the cold heart, the heart that aches, the heart that stands still, the heart that leaps with joy, and the one who has lost heart. Wisdom demands that we teach students of the human sciences about the essence of this heart, the human heart, not the pump that beats in any body, but the one that lives in my body and your body. In a similar fashion, we pass on knowledge about mental illness. Students emerge from school with knowledge about neurotransmitters and schizophrenics and bipolars and borderlines and multiples and obsessive compulsives. They become experts in recognizing illness and disease. But this is where we so often failed them. We failed them because we have not taught them to seek wisdom, to move beyond mere recognition in order to seek the essence of what is. We have failed to teach them to reverence the human being who exists prior to and in spite of the diagnosis we have placed upon them. Just as the generic anatomical heart does not exist, neither does the schizophrenic or the multiple or the bipolar exist outside of a generic textbook. What exists in the truly existential sense of the word is not illness or disease. What exists is a human being, and wisdom demands that we see and reverence this human being before all else. Wisdom demands that we wholeheartedly enter into a relationship with human beings in order to understand them and their experience. Only then will we be able to help in a way that is experienced as truly helpful. Those of us who have been labeled with mental illness are first and foremost human beings. We are more than the sum of the electrochemical activity of our brain. Our hearts are not merely pumps. Our hearts are as real and as vulnerable and as valuable as yours are. We are people. We are people who have experienced great distress and who face the challenge of recovery. The concept of recovery is rooted in the simple yet profound realization that people who have been diagnosed with mental illness are human beings. Like a pebble that's tossed into the center of a still pool, this very simple fact radiates in ever larger ripples until every corner of academic and applied mental health sciences and clinical practice are affected. Those of us who have been diagnosed are not objects to be acted upon. We are fully human subjects who can act, and in acting, change our world. We are fully human subjects, and we can speak for ourselves. We have a voice, and we can learn to use it. We have the right to be heard and listened to. We can become self-determining. We can take a stand toward what is distressing to us, and need not be passive victims of an illness. We can become experts in our own journey of recovery. Now, the goal of recovery is not to get mainstreamed. That's a term we use a lot in the United States, getting mainstreamed, channeled into the mainstream of what everyone else is doing. No, the goal of recovery is not to get mainstreamed. We don't want to be mainstreamed. We say, let the mainstream become a wider stream that has room for all of us and leaves no one stranded on the fringes. The goal of the recovery process is not to become normal. The goal is to embrace our human vocation of becoming more deeply, more fully human. The goal is not normalization. The goal is to become the unique, awesome, never to be repeated human being that we are called to be. The philosopher Martin Heidegger said that to be human means to be a question in search of an answer. That's Heidegger's essential definition of what it means to be human. To be human means to be a question in search of an answer. And those of us who have been labeled with mental illness are not de facto excused from this most fundamental task of becoming human. In fact, because many of us have experienced our lives and dreams shattering in the wake of mental illness, one might even say the most essential challenges that face us is to ask, who can I become? And why should I say yes to life now? To be human means to be a question in search of an answer. However, many of us who have been psychiatrically labeled have received very powerful messages from professionals who in effect tell us that by virtue of our diagnosis, the question of our being has already been answered, and that our futures are already sealed. For instance, I can remember such a time during my third hospitalization. I was 18 years old. I asked the psychiatrist I was working with, "What's wrong with me?" And he said, quote, "You have a disease called chronic schizophrenia. It is a disease that is like diabetes. If you take medications for the rest of your life and avoid stress, then maybe you can cope," unquote. And as he spoke these words, I could feel the weight of them crushing in on me, crushing my already fragile hopes and dreams and aspirations for my life. Even some 22 years later, those words still echo like a haunting memory that does not fade. And today, I understand why this experience was so damaging to me. In essence, the psychiatrist was telling me that my life, by virtue of being labeled with schizophrenia, was already a closed book. The book of my life had already been written. He was saying that my future had already been written. The goals and dreams that I aspired to were mere fantasies according to his prognosis of doom. When the future has been closed off in this way, then the present loses its orientation and becomes nothing but a succession of unrelenting, unrelated moments. And today I know that this psychiatrist had little wisdom at that time. He merely had some knowledge and recognized me as the schizophrenic who had been handed down through the generations by Kraepelin and Bleuler. He did not see me. He saw an illness. We must urge our students to seek wisdom, to move beyond mere recognition of illness, and to wholeheartedly encounter the human being who comes for help. It is imperative that we teach students that relationship is the most powerful tool they have in working with people. Beyond the goals of recovery, there is the question of the process of recovery. How does one enter into the journey of recovery? Today, I would like to begin a conceptualization of recovery as a journey of the heart. And we will begin in that place where many people find themselves, in that place of being hard of heart and not caring anymore. Prior to becoming active participants in our own recovery process, many of us find ourselves in a time of great apathy and indifference. It is a time of having a hardened heart, of not caring anymore. It is a time when we feel ourselves to be among the living dead, alone, abandoned, and adrift on a dead and silent sea, without course or bearing. If I turn my gaze back, I can see myself at 17 years old, diagnosed with chronic schizophrenia, drugged on Haldol, and sitting in a chair. And as I conjure the image, the first thing I can see are that girl's yellow, nicotine-stained fingers. I can see her shuffled, stiff, and drugged walk. Her eyes do not dance. The dancer has collapsed, and her eyes are dark, and they stare endlessly into nowhere. People would come and people would go. People would urge me to do things to help myself, but my heart was hard. And this girl, as I see her, that I once was, she cares nothing except about sleeping, sitting, and smoking cigarettes. Her day consists of this. At 8 in the morning, she forces herself out of bed. In a drugged haze, she sits in a chair, the same chair every day. She begins smoking cigarettes. Cigarette after cigarette. Cigarettes mark the passing of time. Cigarettes are proof that time is passing, and that fact at least is a relief. From 9 to noon, she sits and smokes and stares. Then she has lunch. At 1 p.m., she goes back to bed to sleep until 3 p.m. At that time, she returns to the chair and sits and smokes and stares. Then she has dinner. Then she returns to the chair at 6 p.m. And finally, it's 8 o'clock in the evening, the long-awaited hour, the time to go back to bed and to collapse into a drugged and dreamless sleep. This scenario unfolds the next day and the next and the next until the months pass by in numbing succession, marked only by the next cigarette and the next. During this time, people would try to motivate me. I remember people trying to make me participate in food shopping on Wednesday afternoons, or to help bake bread, or to go on a boat ride. But nothing anyone did touched me or moved me or mattered to me. I had given up. Giving up was a solution for me. The fact that I was supposedly unmotivated was seen as a problem by the people who worked with me. But for me, giving up was not a problem. It was a solution. It was a solution because it protected me from wanting anything. If I didn't want it, then it couldn't be taken away from me. If I tried, then I wouldn't have to undergo another failure. If I didn't care, then nothing could hurt me again. My heart became hardened. The spring came and went, and I didn't care. Holidays came and went, and I didn't care. My friends went off to college and started new lives, and I didn't care. A friend whom I once loved very much came over to visit me, and I didn't care. I remember sitting and smoking as she spoke, and I said almost nothing. And as soon as the clock struck 8, I remember interrupting her in mid-sentence and telling her to go home because I was going to bed. Without even saying goodbye, I headed for my bed. My heart was real hard, and I didn't care about anything. I trust that the picture I am painting here is familiar to many of us. We recognize this picture of apathy, withdrawal, isolation, and lack of motivation. But if we go beyond mere recognition in search of wisdom, we must dig deeper. What is this apathy, indifference, hardness of heart, which keeps so many people in a mode of survival rather than actively entering into their own journey of recovery? Is it merely the negative symptoms of schizophrenia? I think not. Is it drug-induced mental Parkinsonism? Very often, yes. But there's something else, too. I believe that this hardness of heart and not caring anymore is an adaptive strategy that desperate people who are at the brink of losing hope adopt in order to remain alive. Hope is not just a nice-sounding euphemism. Hope and biological life are inextricably bound. Martin Seligman's work in the field of learned helplessness offers us great insight into the chiasmic intertwining of hope and biological life. He cites this example, which was reported by a psychologist named Lefcourt in 1973 in the American Journal of Psychology. Here's what Lefcourt reported, quote, "This writer witnessed one such case of death due to a loss of will within a psychiatric hospital. A female patient who had remained in a mute state for nearly 10 years was shifted to a different floor of her building, along with her floor mates, while her unit was being redecorated. The third floor of this psychiatric unit, where the patient in question had been living, was known among the patients as the chronic, hopeless floor." So essentially what we have here is a woman who had been living for 10 years on the third floor of this particular psychiatric unit, mute, withdrawn, uncommunicative, and suddenly there's going to be redecoration, repainting of the unit, and she's going to be moved off of the unit along with the rest of the folks on the unit. She was moved down to the first floor, and Lefcourt tells us, in contrast, the first floor was most commonly occupied by patients who held privileges, including the freedom to come and go on the hospital grounds and to the surrounding streets. In short, the first floor was an exit ward from which patients could anticipate discharge fairly rapidly. All patients who were temporarily moved from the third floor were given medical examinations prior to the move. And the patient in question was judged to be in excellent medical health, though she remained still mute and withdrawn. Okay, she was given a medical exam. Her health was real good, but she remained mute and withdrawn. And then she was transferred down to this unit with a possibility for getting a pass for discharge existed, a hope-filled environment. So all the patients were moved. Shortly after moving to the first floor, this chronic psychiatric patient surprised the ward staff by becoming socially responsive. such that within a 2-week period, she ceased being mute and was actually becoming gregarious. As fate would have it, I would erase that and say as the treatment team would have it, the redecoration and painting of the 3rd floor was soon completed, and all previous residents were returned to it. Within a week after she had been returned to the hopeless unit, this patient collapsed and died. The subsequent autopsy revealed no pathology of note, and it was whimsically suggested at the time that the patient had died of despair. Seligman goes on to comment, quote, "Hope of release can be sustaining. When one gives up hope, when one believes that all efforts have failed and would continue to fail, human beings can die. Can a psychological state be lethal? I believe it can. When animals and men learn that their actions are futile and that there is no hope, they become more susceptible to death. Conversely, the belief in control over the environment can prolong life." To paraphrase Seligman, I would say that when those of us with psychiatric disabilities come to believe that all of our efforts are futile, when we experience that we have no control over our environment, when nothing we do seems to matter or make the situation better, when we follow the treatment team's instructions and achieve their treatment goals for us, and still no placement opens up in the community for us, when we try one medication after another one after another one and none seem to be of any help, when we find that staff do not listen to us and that they make all of the major decisions for us, when staff decide where we will live, with whom we will live, under what rules we will live, how we will spend our money, if we will even be allowed to spend our money, when we will have to leave a group home and at what time we will be allowed back into it, etc., etc., etc. These are the decisions that the staff make so often. Then a deep sense of hopelessness, of despair, begins to settle over the human heart. And in an effort to avoid the biologically disastrous effects of profound hopelessness, people with psychiatric disabilities do what other people do. We grow hard of heart and attempt to stop caring. It is safer to become helpless than to become hopeless. Of course, the great danger is that mental health professionals will fail to recognize the intensity of the existential struggle that the person who is hard of heart is struggling through. The danger is that the staff will simply say, "Oh, this person just has a lot of negative signs and symptoms, and that's a poor prognosis, and we really mustn't expect much from this person." Or staff may become judgmental and dismiss us as simply being lazy and unmotivated. Or the staff may succumb to their own despair and simply write us off as being, quote, low functioning. Now, it's imperative that the instructors and field trainers of the next generation of mental health professionals help today's students to avoid these pitfalls. It is imperative that students be helped to understand that being hard-hearted is not caring are highly motivated, adaptive strategies used by desperate people who are at great risk of losing hope. We must help students understand and empathize with the deep existential struggle that is at the heart of this dark night of despair. There are a number of things I tell students about how to work with people who appear to be hard of heart, apathetic, and unmotivated. First, I help the student understand the behavior in terms of its existential significance. I want the student to grasp the magnitude of what it is they are asking a person to risk when they ask them to start to care about something again. I want them to understand that under the hardened heart lies a breaking heart. Under that hardened heart lies a breaking heart. How much suffering, how much loss can a human heart hold before it breaks? It is not a crazy thing to try to protect such a vulnerable heart. Students must be helped to honor the strategy of giving up and to understand that perhaps that people shall never risk again. In any case, it is only the person whom we're trying to help who has the power to take the risk, to care about something. Something as simple perhaps as caring enough to put a poster on your bedroom wall, or caring enough to wear some new clothes, or to try a job. These may seem like small things, but if we understand their full existential significance, such acts are small steps toward caring, toward admitting that I just might want to participate in the human community again. Secondly, I ask students to suspend their perception of people as chronic mental patients and to try to see us as heroes. I ask them, could you have survived what this individual has survived? Perhaps this individual has done what you could not do. Perhaps those of us with psychiatric disabilities are in fact not weak or fragile, sick people. Perhaps those of us with psychiatric disabilities are incredibly strong and have fiercely tenacious spirits. Could you live on $530 a month in the United States and cope with a disability at the same time? If a student can momentarily drop out of their distanced professional posture and in true humility come to see a person with a psychiatric disability as a hero who has survived, then I say there is a good prognosis for that student. That student has a chance of becoming human-hearted while working in the human services, and this, of course, is no small accomplishment. Finally, I try to help students understand that although they do not have the power to change or to motivate a person with a psychiatric disability who is hard of heart, they do have the power to change the environment, including the human interactive environment in which that person is surviving. When working with a person with a psychiatric disability who is hard of heart, who has given up, and who is motivated not to care anymore, we must understand that this person feels as if they have no power. They experience, and indeed oftentimes it's quite an accurate interpretation of what's going on, that all of the power is in the hands of the people around them. People in this experience need to have the experience of having control over their own decisions and over their lives. For such people, it is imperative to create an environment in which there are choices to be made. And I'm speaking here not of forced choice, such as either you take your medications or you go back to the hospital. Not forced choice, because that's little more than coercion, but of real choices. I am speaking here of all types of choices, from small concerns such as what flavor ice cream you may want, to what coffee shop you may want to go to what kinds of vocational or educational goals you might want to pursue. The person with a hardened heart will reject and reject and reject these invitations to choose. However, the staff must not fall into despair, feel like their efforts are futile. Staff must not grow hard of heart themselves. Staff have to keep caring, to hold the care when the person with the hardened heart says, I no longer care. Staff need to avoid the trap of despair. So choices, options, information, role models, being heard, developing and exercising a voice, opportunities for bettering one's life. These are the features of a human interactive environment which support the transition from not caring to caring, from surviving to becoming an active participant in one's own recovery process. Creating such environments are the skills which tomorrow's mental health professionals must master. As for myself, I cannot remember a specific moment when I turned that corner from surviving to becoming an active participant in my own recovery process. My efforts to protect my breaking heart by becoming hard of heart and not caring about anything lasted for a long time. One thing I can recall is that the people around me did not give up on me. They kept inviting me to do things, no matter how often I would reject them. I can remember one day, for no particular reason, saying yes to helping with food shopping. Now, all I would do was push that cart, but it was a beginning. And truly, it was through small steps like these that I slowly began to discover that I could take a stand towards what was distressing me. I know that anger, especially angry indignation, played a big role in that transition. When that psychiatrist told me that the best I could hope for was to take my medications, avoid stress, and cope, I became very, very angry. However, by that point, I was in my third hospitalization, and I was smart enough to keep my angry indignation to myself, because rule number 1 is to never get enraged in a psychiatrist's office if you're labeled with chronic schizophrenia. But I do remember leaving that office visit and deciding that somehow I needed to become powerful enough to change the mental health system. And I remember thinking, from my viewpoint at 18, that the people who carried the most keys on their belt, that could open all the doors, seemed to have the most power. And I thought Dr. Deegan had a nice ring to it. So I decided, that I would do it, that I would become Dr. Deegan. And it's interesting to me that it was out of this sense of outrage, of indignity, that what was really arising inside me was not just anger, but angry indignation. And that word's very important, because in that word indignation is hidden that word dignity. We must be very, very careful to understand that people getting angry, or that anger is not a symptom of mental illness, that we do not medicate people because they're getting angry. I talk to lots of people about their story of recovery, and they tell me over and over and over again that it was angry indignation that ignited or signaled an upsurge of their human dignity, and they were coming back to life. And God forbid that we medicate that away, because that's the turning point. It's not the whole story, but it's an important turning point. I should tell you that having decided that I wanted to get an advanced degree and work in mental health, that I was careful not to share my newfound inspiration with anybody. Because imagine what my treatment team would have said to me had I announced at the age of 18, having virtually flunked out of high school, and with a combined graduate record examination score of 800, I think you get 600 points for putting your name on the test, so it wasn't a high score, that I had gone into my treatment team and said, you know, team, I think that I'm going to become a clinical psychologist and change the mental health system, because I think it needs some changing. Well, delusions of grandeur, I mean, it just would not have went over well. So I kept my secret, and I shared it with a few friends. Starting with one course in English composition at the local community college, I started on my way. And I'd be dragging my textbook back into the mental hospital with me, or trying to read with double vision due to the prolixin, but I inched my way forward. Now, I had a survivor mission, okay, a strong mission, a strong sense of purpose that was keeping me going. Beyond that, I had a strong spirituality, a strong relationship with my God, and that I really relied on that. I had a good therapeutic alliance with a psychotherapist who believed in me. It was very important for me. I lived with really weird hippies, and they had this wonderful tolerance for very weird behavior. So my psychotic episodes went virtually unnoticed in the commune I lived in. After some experimenting in my early teens, I somehow intuited that drugs and alcohol were bad news for me, and I did not use them, even though the people around me did. And in retrospect, I know this was a very wise decision for me. I read lots of books about healing and psychopathology and personality theory, all in an effort to understand myself and my situation. I was always trying new ways of coping with symptoms, including my relentless auditory hallucinations. And perhaps most importantly of all, when I get out of bed in the morning, I always knew the reason why. I really did have a purpose in life. I had been called, I had a vocation, and I kept saying yes to it. And even in the present, I must make a daily affirmation of my vocation in order to keep going, because the temptation to give up can be great. My journey of recovery is still ongoing. I still struggle with symptoms, grieve the losses I have sustained, and have had to get involved in treatment for the sequelae of child abuse. I'm also involved in self-help and mutual support, and I still use professional services, including medications, psychotherapy, and even sometimes I use the hospital. However, now I do not just take medications or just go to the hospital. This is the passive stance. I have learned in recovery to use medications and to use the hospital. This is the active stance that's the hallmark of the recovery process. And of course, there's more to the recovery process than simply recovering from mental illness. We must also recover from the effects of poverty, second-class citizenship. We must learn to raise our consciousness and find our collective pride in order to overcome internalized stigma. Finally, many of us emerge from mental health settings, treatment settings, with traumatic stress disorders related to having sustained or witnessed physical, sexual, and/or emotional abuse at the hands of hospital staff or other inmates. As one long-term veteran of mental health services wrote, "The stuff I've been through was like a nightmare. Sometimes I go back into the nightmare. I cry every night about it. Remembering it is like being in the nightmare again. Sometimes I scream at night because I dream about the hospital I was raped in or the hospital I was held down in 4-point restraint. I've been through it all." So my point here is that sometimes recovering from mental illness is the easy part. Recovering from the deep wounds to the human heart takes much longer. In summary, then, recovery does not mean cure. Rather, recovery is an attitude. It's a stance, and it's a way of approaching the day's challenges. It is not a perfectly linear journey. There are times of rapid gains and disappointing relapses. There are times of just living, just staying quiet, resting, and regrouping. Each person's journey of recovery is unique. Each person must find what works for them. This means that we must have the opportunity to try and fail and to try again. In order to support the recovery process, mental health professionals must not rob us of the opportunity to fail. Professionals must embrace the concept of the dignity of risk and the right to failure if they're to be supportive of us. In closing, I just want to say that I have been haunted for years by this sculpture that sits in the center of your city. Zatkina was the sculptor, and many of you will find a photograph of the sculpture that I'm speaking of on the front of your catalogs. I first became familiar with the sculpture through a photograph I saw back in 1988. Bessel van der Kolk uses it. He's from the Netherlands, and he uses it on his book on psychological trauma. And it's amazing to come back to Rotterdam and actually have a chance to see the sculpture in person. And when I look at that sculpture, I see that the hands are raised above the head. It's almost like I fight with the sculpture. I want to talk to the sculpture. And I want to say to the sculpture, in one way, its hands are open, so vulnerable, you know, and you can almost imagine the bombs raining down, you know. And I want to say, close your fists, you know, fight back. But no, the sculpture is so vulnerable. And then I see the head thrown back in agony, and the mouth wide open in a silent scream, you know, and the knees bent. And I'm always wanting to walk up to the statue and say, are you going to fall down and buckle under the weight of this violence and oppression, or are your knees actually lifting you up at this point? So when I came here, I thought that statue was something about hope. So I started asking Dutch people, what is the statue? And they told me that the name for the statue was the city, the destroyed city, or the city without a heart. And I said, well, I need to get a heart and put it in that statue. It needs a heart. And each of the Dutch people I spoke to about it, I said, is this a hopeful monument? And they said no. They said it's very, very sad. And I said, oh, but it has to be hopeful. I need to get a heart in that statue. And then something, they always said to me, though, and it was very instructive, they said, but look around, they said. Look what's rising up around the city with the broken heart, with no heart, the city with the heart missing. And what I see coming about is new life, a new city. But the new city was not built on top of the old city, okay? Because they have there the statue, you know, with the heart missing. And I said, somehow, there's some very important wisdom here that really does move me. Somehow we need in English to develop a word that can hold both ideas at the same time. That as a person with a psychiatric disability, there are wounds that I carry in my heart that are continue at times to break my heart, and I don't know will ever be mended. I'm not sure will ever be fully healed. There's a sadness in the center of my heart, as there are in the hearts of many, many people, not just myself, okay? And to somehow find a word that could embrace that sadness, that hole in my heart, which remains, and also the concept that around it, a whole new city, a whole new life is emerging. Not built on top of the heart to cover it up, but that both are there at the same time. And so for your sculpture, I thank you for the Dutch people for the very important lesson you've been teaching me about this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Patricia Deegan, thank you very much for your inspiring and emotional lecture. People want to change rooms,